right. Thank you for the music. That was a great way to get started. I'm pumped up now. Good evening, everybody, or wherever you happen to be in the world, the middle of the night for some. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Women in Global Health Georgia Chapter's Holiday Virtual Storytelling Salon. We know that it's a really busy time of year for everyone, and we're really thankful and grateful that you chose to spend your evening with us. My name's Alyssa Lowe. I'm a Senior Research Associate with the Health Policy Center. We are housed within the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University. And starting next year, I'm very honored to be joining Rachel Hall Clifford as co-chair of the Women in Global Health Georgia's chapter. So those who might not be familiar with Women in Global Health, I'll give a little bit of information on the organization. WGH is a global movement with the largest network of women and allies working to, quote, challenge power and privilege for gender equality in health. The organization aims to enable women from around the world to engage at national and global levels in policy development, leadership, and advocates for women's inclusion in global health decision-making. The WGH Georgia chapter launched in January of 2021. So we're coming up on our 1-year anniversary, and we'll be sure to let you all know how we plan to celebrate that. The Georgia chapter is hosted by the Center for Global Health Innovation, a nonprofit organization based here in Atlanta. Now I'm excited to introduce our storytelling event. First, on behalf of our chapter, I would like to thank WGH Global, whose generous support made tonight's event possible. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the curator of tonight's event, Dr. Nandini Oomman. Dr. Oomman is a global health specialist and founding curator and CEO of the Women's Storytelling Salon. The Women's Storytelling Salon is a storytelling platform that's dedicated to making women and girls visible in their leadership and participation in the workforce. Dr. Oomman has over 20 years of research, program, and policy experience in global development, and is passionate about improving health and education for all. Thank you all again for coming. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Oomman, who will introduce tonight's theme and goals, and introduce our very esteemed featured storyteller and stellar DJ, Dr. Dazon Diallo. Dr. Oomman, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Alyssa, for the kind introduction. And I just wanted to continue with the dance party. Diallo, Dazon is a fabulous DJ over and above being a storyteller. So thanks for your music, Dazon. That was wonderful. So good evening to everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'd like to welcome all of you. We had about 60 people, I think, sign up, so I'm sure people will still come in. But we're going to start anyway because we want to actually hear as much of Dazon's story as we can. So it's very special to have Dazon as our storyteller. She's beaming in from South Africa, so she's up very late today, which is extremely kind of her to actually agree to do this, even though she was going to be in South Africa for work that she's doing there. And a special welcome to those who are members of the Women in Global Health chapter from Georgia. We're just so happy that the chapter members reached out to us, your leadership, to help create this salon. And we're very excited to partner with you for this holiday celebration salon. So we will do the salon in 2 parts. The first part will be around the storytelling, where I will curate the story with Dazon. And then we're hoping to keep at least 30 minutes at the end for the Q&A session. So please feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat box with your name. And my colleagues will be collating these questions, and I will try to my best to address most of them as best as I can in the time that we have left. So just a quick, sort of 3 points on housekeeping. If you'd like to live tweet photographs or thoughts from the session, please go ahead. I think the handles are going to be put in the chat. that would be great to tag us. We also encourage that people have debate and differences of opinion, but we want to request that you reserve your judgment about people's stories. There's no right and wrong in the paths that we take to become who we are. So we'd like people to be mindful about this when you use social media or when you ask questions and share comments. And then lastly, we are recording the virtual salon because a lot of people would like to, who couldn't participate, will watch later. Alyssa already spoke briefly about the salon, and I just wanted to say that very simply, our vision at the salon is to shift the narrative about women and girls. And why do we say this? Because we feel that storytelling is a key way to actually do this in a way that data and evidence cannot. So the Women's Storytelling Salon is actually part of a larger storytelling venture that my colleague Catherine Kahn and I will be launching early next year. And this is because we have learned in the last 6 years of doing the storytelling that stories can be very creative and trigger empathy when people actually listen to stories. And it has the potential to be a very effective equity building tool because narratives can focus on power and privilege in a way that data and evidence alone cannot. And so it helps people identify with issues in a personal way, and storytelling makes numbers come alive, provides context and the why for success and failure, making it an essential tool in research, policy, and program. So stay tuned for more on that, and please do join our Women's Storytelling Salon list by going to our website and clicking over there. And we'd love to have you join some of our other salons as well. And in terms of our mission and how we do this, our tagline is find it, own it, share it. And it's because we work at the sort of individual level with leaders to find their stories. And we know that that sounds sort of simple and it's almost like trivial. Why would anyone want to find their story? But actually what we found is that it's not that easy. And most women that we've approached for the salon often say, I don't really know if my story is that interesting. But we do know that every woman has a story, and your story is interesting. And not only that, when you do find your story, you begin to own your story. And when you own your story, it powers you to share it in different ways. So the message we want to leave with you is really your story, your power. I'm going to introduce Dazon shortly, but I wanted to take a few minutes to set the stage for the remarkable story that you're going to hear. So just as we thought that the world was coming to grips with COVID-19, we see how gross inequalities in the COVID response regarding testing initially and now vaccination are really coming back to bite us. And when I say us, I mean all of us in the world. We see that Delta and Omicron are fast spreading all over the world because more than half of the world remains unvaccinated. Just yesterday, Dr. Tedros, the DG of WHO, said that 41 countries have still not been able to vaccinate even 10% of their population. And 98 countries have not reached 40%. So this inequality isn't new at all. And that's what tonight's story is all about. Dazon saw this inequality in the fight against HIV and dedicated much of her career, and still does, to address gender, race, and income inequalities in the AIDS response. Over the years, she has become a recognized visionary and advocate in the struggle for human rights, sexual and reproductive justice, with and on behalf of communities of women and girls living with HIV and those at risk for HIV and STIs. So I'm not going to do any big bio explanation. You could read all about Dazon. She does a million different things. If I spent all my time talking about that, you wouldn't hear her story, and you learn about her story from the actual storytelling. But I do want to say that she's the founder and president of SisterLove, Inc., which was set up in 1989. She is definitely a visionary advocate and an ideas maven. This is her own words, for human rights, sexual and reproductive justice. And the mission of SisterLove is to eradicate the adverse impact of HIV, sexual and reproductive health rights and justice, challenges that impact women and their families in the United States and around the world. So with that, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dazon to the storytelling stage.
Hi, Nandini. Thank you so very much. And thank you for that beautiful intro and the opening, and for indulging my other favorite thing, which is to share my rhythm and sound. So thank you so very much. And congratulations to the 1 year anniversary on the Atlanta chapter. I do want to just remind it, as Alyssa was talking, I was like, wait, 2019 at APHA, the American Public Health Association's national conference, you know how big they are. I had the privilege of sitting on a panel, and sharing the panel with me is your global president and CEO of Women in Global Health. It was phenomenal conversation that we had. So I'm feeling the alignment. Thank you.
Wonderful. So Dazon, let's kick off the storytelling by getting you to actually describe yourself. I like to do this because I like to get sort of a snapshot. Describing yourself as a professional today, not official titles, but as a human being. You know, what qualities define you?
Wow. So I think if I define me, you know how we think other people define us differently, but it turns out that we're pretty much in sync when I ask people. And the first thing that I say that defines me is that people would see me as a servant, that whether it's a servant leader, whether it's a servant worker, whether it's someone who spends time making sure that whatever it is that I do, that it contributes or supports someone else, or that it helps in some way. I'm serious about the work that I do, but I don't take myself too seriously. I think that it's important for me to know my issues and to be able to express what those issues are so that I can elicit the help that I need to fill in the gaps of the places where I'm not great. I am definitely driven. I go from plan A to Z. And if I run out of the alphabet, I pick up the Greek letters. So whatever that is, it's making sure that we never say quit when we know that what we're doing is the right thing. And I love innovating. I like to shake stuff up. I can't turn the ideas off. So that's why I call myself an ideas maven, because I'm a problem solver and a strategist in a lot of ways. And that what I found out about myself too, and I thought it was a problem, but it turns out that because I have it sort of in context and in reality, and also within my own understanding of purpose, is that I know that I think in the future and live in the present. So whatever it is that I'm doing now, I know that it's because I've already kind of seen, without sounding too weird about it, that I've seen where we're going or where we need to be or want to be, and recognizing what has to happen today to get us there. So that's the kind of way I think I would describe myself and how I work.
That's wonderful. And I really do love the think and dream and thinking in the future and living in the present. I think it's so important to be able to do that. And as an innovator, you have to be able to think ahead of time. So that was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So I thought maybe we could, instead of sort of starting at the beginning of your story, I thought it might be actually really wonderful for people to learn about the many, many different pieces of Dazon Dixon Diallo's amazing life right now. And we'll work then backwards to your origin story and all of that. But I think that if you can tell us some of the key pieces of work that you're involved with right now with SisterLove, that would, I think, be very exciting for the audience to hear.
Right, thank you. It's always an interesting challenge to tell that story, because we used to say that we're a little organization doing a lot of big things, but we're actually a lot bigger than that, but we're still doing even bigger things. So we're consistently reaching, we're not punching people, but we're punching problems and the solutions to those problems way above what our weight looks like. So, and because we do our work or within the framework of intersectionality, because that's what reproductive justice, that's what human rights require, is that we look at the whole and the totality, the lived experience, the entire story, not just one part of a person's story. That's the way our work looks too. So we first and foremost are very intentional about intersecting service delivery with advocacy. So like we have a robust program that does prevention education. We do whether it's screening or testing for HIV and other sexually transmitted infections, for pregnancy. We've also incorporated hepatitis C. We are about to expand into helping more with HPV and self-testing. We do a lot of that. In addition to that, we have policy and advocacy work. We've been a part of developing the first ever Black women's reproductive justice policy agenda that's moving and making its way through Congress with, you know, pages and pages of legislative action. So it's not just, we start with the story in every segment, we talk about a given issue, but then we also come up with a policy or a law, a bill recommendation. It's a very exciting thing that's moving on that end. And now we're developing our own statewide legislative agenda to sort of focus in on Georgia, but use some of the same basic tenets of the national agenda that we introduced in September of 2021. A couple of super exciting things is we've also are very intergenerational in the work that we do. That's also very intentional. Continuing to find ways to work across the different age bands and the experiences, mentoring in two directions, learning in those two directions, sharing the work in those two directions. So we have a core, I think the core signature work that we do comes through an initiative that started us out called Healthy Love. Healthy Love is something that was homegrown. We took it through a whole rigorous evaluation process with the Centers for Disease Control back in the mid to the 2010s, if you will. And that intervention that we created in like 1988, 89 for HIV prevention and affirming women's sexuality and self-determination and bodily autonomy has morphed and been adapted. And now we have biomedical preventions. We want to make sure that we're dealing with gender-based violence in the same conversations around HIV prevention or STI prevention and treatment, planning and being intentional about how we determine our own families. And so we're just now starting to do a different piece of work. This is so exciting. We're starting to do a different piece of work where we're moving away from this public health approach to focusing people on risk, right? Having to sit in front of a woman and regardless of her identity and ask her about her sex partners, how many sex partners she's had, whether she knows that they're living with HIV, do they have other risk factors, all of that kind of stuff is almost a non-starter if we want to get people to really think about the different tools that we have out here to help prevent HIV, for example, when we're sitting in front of her, helping her think of everything that's wrong with her sex life. So we have actually flipped all of that, and we have begun, even in our intake forms, our assessments, our conversation, our language, we've removed risk out of our language and replaced it with sexual health, well-being, and pleasure. So we talk in the context of having them tell us their story of what they like, how they like it, with whom they like it, how often they like it. Tell us your story about what your aspirations are for your best sexual and reproductive health. And then here are some of the tools we have or that we know about that we can make recommendations, or you can ask us any questions and see what might fit to help you achieve those optimal experiences with your own sexual life. And as a result of making this change and doing the community-based work and the assessment work that we had to do, one of our pharmaceutical partners that's about to roll out some implementation studies, for example, on their new injectable HIV prevention drug, are going to use our sexual health assessment as a part of their study. So they are also reframing risk. And lastly, the international piece is just off the mark. We'll get to that.
We'll get to that, Dazon.
Yeah.
Right.
The last part is what we also do is we've got the policy and advocacy, we've got the health education and prevention that I've talked about. We do a lot of leadership work, our source leadership, because the sources of the lived experiences are where we want to build leadership. So we do leadership with women living with HIV, through our Leading Women's Society. We have the Healthy Love Youth Advocates. So we're doing a lot of leadership development work with young people from 16 to 25 who are learning sexual and reproductive health rights and justice and bringing it into their own community and peer spaces. And we also are building leadership with young people in the LGBTQ community, especially our transgender family. And right now we're fiscally sponsoring and incubating a new organization that is led by transgender men who have sex with men and have some, if not all, of the same sexual health and reproductive health access challenges that cisgender women do. So big things are going, the research work. I told you, I think when we spoke, we have 15, we now have 16 studies, and they are just rolling out like gangbusters. People are so excited when they see community actually directly involved in conducting research, not just on the sidelines or in the advisory spaces, but that we're actually doing it, and it's really engaging folks. So that's just a little bit.
Yeah, I know. It's incredible, the depth and breadth of the work that you do. But I think what's phenomenal about it is that the community participation and active designing of programs is really done with what I don't love the term, but what we like to call beneficiaries in global health and development, right? So these are people who are very active in actually designing the programs that will serve them. So I think that's amazing. And of course, we haven't even touched all the media part that you do and you're doing with National Geographic and CNN and Al Jazeera, but we'll come to that and maybe bring that out in some questions, as well as your radio show. So I think that would be wonderful to touch on later. But I wanted to start with maybe rewind a little bit and go to, what I like to call your origin story. So when I hear the name Dazon Dixon Diallo, I can tell that there are many worlds contained in that name, right? And so it would be wonderful to hear about your origin story and understand how your childhood really shaped who you are today. So maybe we can start with your family and where you grew up, because that always ends up being actually a very illuminating part of someone's story.
I have probably, and I'm saying this with as much immodesty as I can because it's just truth, I think I have one of the luckiest experiences in terms of family and having grounding and a firm foundation that helps me clearly know who I am and what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. I grew up in a very, very, very small town, and actually in the smallest county and the youngest county in the state of Georgia. People can look it up. It's Peach County. We're the Peach State, and I'm the last county out of 159 is the Peach County of the Peach State, where we build and are the home of the very original yellow school buses. The invention of school buses comes from my hometown. And the other parts that we do is we still raise peaches, pecans, and cotton, and Black college and Black educated folks. So I grew up in a small Black college town with educators. My father and my mother both are biologists. My father is in the university system and retired about 12 years ago. My mother taught biology in the public school system. And we only have one public school, whole county. So you know how we have preachers' kids? Well, my sister, my brother, and I, we were the teachers' kids, because everybody knows you when you have one biology teacher for everybody in the whole county. And what's wonderful about coming up in that environment is that it was all school all the time. Even when it was super fun, we were still geared into learning and to being strategic and thinking and solving our own problems. I think I might have mentioned some of the things my father did say and still says is things like, use your brain when we ask a question. Think, damn it. That was his other thing that he would always say. And that's how we've learned to work through life, because it became not just a mantra, but a habit. It's how we learn how to navigate life. And the fact that I grew up in a house where sexual health and reproductive health was as normal in our conversations as talking about, entomology or animal health, or my mother is also a botanist. So it was all a part of the same science. So I have a very pragmatic background. Both my parents come from big families and really tight and really close, as big as we are. And so that's the stuff. It's also one of those things that, not like it was a perfect upbringing or upgrowing, but because they're so practical and pragmatic and believe in what we do has to contribute to something better and greater than us. Even when we had our own family issues, there were ways that through reasoning or through logic or through, I want to say literally through science, because if you had the evidence to show here's how we need to do this better or do this differently, then people would change. And I say that in making sure that people understand that trauma and those kinds of experiences that happen don't always have to live through us as we grow into adulthood. If there are ways to deal with those traumas along the way, they then become a part of your story and not necessarily a part of your pathology. And that's what I express about where I grew up and how wonderful it was to grow up not only in a house, but on a college campus and with a community of people who believed in education, because all of our older folks in my family or of my parents' friends and social networks were all educators or faculty members or staff or administrators or other parents of folks who were over at the university or in school.
And I think that seems to obviously have had a big impact on the way you have conducted your life and designed how you want to live. And as you said, you're a problem solver because you learned how to be a problem solver when you're young. And I like to ask about this origin story because I do believe that an origin story does really often have the grounding of your story on which you build, right? So that is literally like the foundation that I think helps us all build our story as we live through life. So that's wonderful. And it's nice to put you in the context of the peach country in Georgia, because I love those peaches in the summer. But I wanted to move then to the wonderful stories that you shared with us about, how you actually entered the workforce and started working in this area of health. So in particular, I think it would be wonderful to hear the story of the major event that happened on campus when you were working there and all these phenomenal women, walked by. Yeah. So if you can share that story, I think that would be wonderful.
I absolutely will. And the other part that's connected to that lovely life coming from this small town in Georgia is also that when I was a teenager, just starting high school is the year that my parents decided to move out of town. It's a small town, so you're already country. But then to move from that to a farm outside of town, right, as a teenager, So I graduated high school in 3 years. And I was like, I'm not going to Fort Valley State because I'm getting out of here. I'm not going to stay on this farm. And I ended up attending what is my alma mater now, which was Spelman College in Atlanta. Very, very, very proud of being a Spelman alumna. And the minute I reached that campus, because of the education and the opportunities that I had, I immediately became a part of the anti-apartheid movement, which was in its height at that time in the early 80s on college campuses all across the United States, students working with other staff and faculty to get their schools to divest, right, from South Africa to help bring the apartheid regime to its knees. And so that started out a little bit of a conflict for me on my campus right off the bat, because our president, who was the last male president of this all-Black women's college, by the way, and prior to his resignation, we never had a Black woman president of this Black women's institution. And so because he was a constructive engager, he didn't appreciate our activism, and I had a hard time. And I ended up working, well, okay, aside for those 6 months at McDonald's, during which I became a vegetarian, I haven't eaten at McDonald's since then. That could be a whole nother conversation about what I know about the insides, what goes into your McDonald's
Right.
food. But I ended up working in the Feminist Women's Health Center. Now, between my freshman and sophomore year, because I went into the health center right at the end of my sophomore year, but the summer prior to that, I had a work study job on campus giving tours to prospective students and their families. One day I'm giving a tour and I literally see like Angela Davis and June Jordan and Paula Giddings and some other, amazing, illustrious Black women, activist writers, Sweet Honey and the Rock, and all of their amazing, complimentary regalia were walking across the campus. And on this day today, I think it's important to acknowledge that it was when, because I was studying Black women's literature as an English major by that time, Bell Hooks was on our campus on that day.
Yeah.
And that's when I met her, and that's what I remember, and how she became one of my big mamas in the Black women's health movement. But the point being, all of those Black women were on that campus that day because Billie Avery and other women had called the first ever National Conference on Black Women's Health Issues. And it was held on Spelman's campus in the summer of 1983, when they expected about 200 people to show up, and over 2,000 women came.
Wow.
That week, I played hooky from my job, and it changed my life. From that moment forward, didn't know I was going into sexual and reproductive health and rights work. What I knew was that being at a Black women's institution actually wasn't everything that I needed to find my way with my own identity, my own purpose, who I am and who I came from had a story that was powerful enough to, I guess, combine with other stories to tell the story about how Black women, when we organize, we can change things with our own lived experiences. And that sent me on a whole pathway of wanting to find the best ways that our stories could build our power.
Wonderful. And that story of seeing all those, the wonderful women like Angela Davis and Paula Giddings, and as you said, Bell Hook, may she rest in power. It was very sad news to hear that. Because I think she defined feminism for many of us, of at least yours and my generation. So, that story definitely gave me the chills, to see these women and have that kind of experience transform really how you decide to do your life's work. And as you say, it's not just the education that shaped it, it was truly this experience. And this is something I like younger women to actually hear, because it is not really only about the degrees that we get in colleges. It is about these lived experiences and encounters with people that shape our lives.
I totally agree with you. I think that the next part of that story, of course, is that going through actually a racism conflict on campus, I ended up relinquishing a scholarship, and that's how I ended up going to work at McDonald's, and then had to get out of there and find a new job. My job ended up being with the Feminist Women's Health Center, where there's this a next whole world of understanding the power of knowing your own body, and being able to self-determine whether it's around contraception. I mean, I became one of those few people who had no problems going around, whether it was campuses or community centers, and teaching women how to do self-cervical exams, so that you know as much about the insides of your vagina and how all of your reproductive organs work the same way, as much as your OBGYN or your nurse practitioner would know. And I started working there when I was 18, right? And then 6 years later, I started a nonprofit organization. So Yes, you're absolutely right that there's a lot that we take in from all of our experiences, especially if we're open to understanding how they all fit together. Because, being a student at Spelman and working in that field gave me an opportunity to support young women, especially young Black women, through abortions, through contraceptive health visits, through well woman visits, through pap smears, whatever it was, in ways that they might not have ever felt as comfortable with, or as trusting, or as empowered to be engaged, because there was somebody like me that looked like them, that understood them, because we were the same age, right? That, I think, was also a part of a unique experience that even folks who work in those reproductive health centers nowadays don't have as a part of their story.
I totally hear you on that. So, as much as I would love to go into detail about all of that, I want to move on to what I find a terrific story, and actually a very instructional one for young women who are thinking of being entrepreneurs and not necessarily, going to get a job or get employed, but like you want to start, a non-profit center. So turning to SisterLove, I mean, as you said, you started working at 18, and then at 24, which is young, you set up SisterLove. So for women who are interested in learning how to do that, how do you set up an organization and then grow it to this level? So I think that setting up of how you, and I know some of this is organic, it's not like there's a formula. It's really about your life experience and the right time and the right place. But I think it would be really a wonderful story to know about how you created SisterLove.
Absolutely. I think the first thing is, because we don't spend enough time talking about, gender and how we express our emotions in terms of our engagement. Anger is a powerful motivator. And what I mean by that is, for example, fear tends to paralyze, tends to send people into isolation, but anger brings you to a place where you or I end up expressing myself differently. And so starting SisterLove came out of the fact that I reached a couple of angry inflection points while I was working in that health center. One was I happened to be working the phones in clinic one day when the local AIDS organization called, because they were starting to get all of these calls from women who were concerned about AIDS. This is around 1985, right? The connection to that was that Rock Hudson had made his AIDS diagnosis public, and then, of course, died a couple of days or a couple of weeks later. And that really brought women to attention. And there was nothing that we had at the health center around that, because AIDS wasn't on our radar. It wasn't in our agenda. And so we started volunteering. I'm telling this part of the story because even in a place where I would expect that the organization that is providing feminist, self-determining, self-help, reproductive health care had not yet embraced AIDS as a critical issue. And I will still say to this day, it's because of some of the challenges that Black and brown and other women of color found themselves up against inside the feminist movement, which to this day we still do, but at least we've created some of our own frameworks like reproductive justice to do the work in a different way. But nonetheless, bringing that work, even as a volunteer, into my clinic, after some time, I created a whole project, created a whole program, and they let it go. For whatever reasons, whether it was economical or just not of priority or interest, because they had other priorities that were really pretty serious in terms of protecting women's access to abortion, which is critical. But I understood that there was a racial element to it, and it wasn't acceptable. And so had organized other women of color to be an advisory group to the project that I was doing, and we just became a board and started this thing. Now, the question you ask is, how do you do that? I don't know, at 24, not very wisely. So what I would say, I used to think that it was the ass backwards way to do it, which is to not have an organization, but just to start doing the work. We had this intervention. Let's just start doing it in the community. That's what I did. And we ended up having a fiscal sponsor in going back to that same organization, the AIDS organization that had called us a few years before, which now had a woman executive director who was absolutely embracing of us because they didn't have a women's program. So we got incubated. So those are two things I want to say. One, if you have the idea, if you're working with people who engage in your idea and you can put it to work, put the idea in the community and get that going so that you can build community around the work itself and then figure out how to put the organization around that community's work. And that's what we ended up doing. We were incubated for 3 years. So that gave us a chance to really get the information out there, to get our visibility out there, to build relationships, and then start to form the organization and become a 501c3. It won't easy. That's how we say it.
It won't easy. Yeah.
Yeah, I started with I started with my unemployment check, and I think the first year our only grant was like $2,500. So it was a really tough time, but the stick-to-itiveness that's required to do this work when it's driven from your passion and not from your profession, that it's actually even more successful and more rewarding simply because you're doing what you're supposed to be doing and it's the right thing to do. And so things actually you do the work though, but things actually do sort of kind of just happen because you're aligned with what your purpose is. So that's what I say. No, you don't have to think of what your purpose is. Be open to it when it is exposed to you, and don't second guess it. Don't overthink it. And don't be afraid of it. That the fear factor could stop you from being and doing exactly what it is that you need to do. And so we have to be embracing of that when it comes to us and it shows us and you'll know what it is because it's going to be like the only thing you can think about, just sort of like when you fall in love with somebody.
Right.
The only thing you can think about doing, and if you're not doing it, you feel like you're off kilter or off your path.
So I think that is such a great part of your story, because I think, often we don't talk about these things because they get forgotten, right? Because now SisterLove is like this established organization. People forget about the first few days. How was this actually born? The first few years. And I think this is instructional for women who want to lead organizations for the issues that they are passionate and concerned about. And I think what's a promising sort of horizon in ahead of us is that we have some very interesting shifts in women-led philanthropy happening, where people like Mackenzie Scott and Melinda Gates are giving women the resources to actually realize some of these dreams, but operationalizing them is often tough. So it's important to hear those stories. I think that really does help people to envision how their idea and concept can actually become reality. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think that it's a very powerful one. As mundane as it seems, it's a very powerful one. But then I wanted to move from there onto the work that that has actually evolved at SisterLove. And you mentioned some of the stuff early on. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the, key pieces you mentioned above, like creating the safer sex party. I think that was quite phenomenal. And the fact that CDC actually evaluated that, maybe that would be one story to share. And then the other one that I think would be really wonderful is to talk about how you used storytelling to actually design your programs and interventions.
Absolutely. And, that storytelling, just to start out, circle back, I also like comedy. So that callback, that thing. So the circle back to that moment and that experience with the Black Women's Health Project, which is now the Black Women's Health Imperative, was that is the root of what we learned. The tagline was, what is, Black and female, what is the reality? And we learned how to tell our stories and to learn from and to tap into the power of our stories together, right? So that's why the stories became so important, because I learned from the very beginning that having a brave space, I don't think we don't need safe spaces because those aren't guaranteed as much as brave spaces, to really go in on the stuff that you don't have a place to put it, right? And so that is the way we came into doing this work with SisterLove. And one of those was, how do we sit around and talk about AIDS, or what then became HIV, with women, and talk about sex and then talk about death and dying all at the same time, and expect folks to be running out trying to change their whole lives to stop that from happening to them, especially when there wasn't any messaging around it. So that's how we created this Safer Sex Party. We wanted to create something that was fun, that was engaging and interactive, but that also brought in enough information in a way that was what we actually called it eroticizing safer sex, because we wanted to teach people what to say yes to versus what to say no to, because that's the word that we kept getting. That's the message we kept getting. And it took off from there. What happened though, because we're homegrown, right? Community grown, we're in a small organization, is when the CDC decided that they were focusing in on these, what they call diffused evidence-based interventions, right? You come up with something that works in a given population, and then you test it out, and then you make the generalized assumption that this is going to be an intervention working for everybody within that kind of, or that specific population. And we looked up, and there were interventions that were being created and funded in the millions, right? And at least one of those interventions actually was using our components, and we knew it because she had been at the researcher had been at some of our events in the past. And, we had one of those, oh, hell no moments, right? Like, wait a minute. That's our intervention. It came from our women in our community. We can't get a dime to do it, even though we know it's working, and we don't have a way of telling the story of how we know it's working. And so we petitioned, we applied to the CDC, and we were one of the first homegrown interventions to go through that same rigorous process of determining whether it was evidence-based and whether it was efficacious. And we came to an approval. It took 5 years, and that's about the same time that any institution, academic or otherwise. And so that's the kind of stuff that we had to fight for inclusion. Fighting for inclusion has been our story the whole time. It even, morphs over into how we had to fight for inclusion to make sure that there was women's support groups along with all the other support that was happening, especially for men. We had to take that opportunity and be a part of a national ACT UP. I'm an ACT UPper. ACT UP campaign that actually helped change the CDC definition to include women or gender-related opportunistic infections that were not being diagnosed for women. So, women who were dying of cervical cancer probably had cervical cancer because they also had HIV, and were never diagnosed or tested for that. And so we, came up with that campaign, because with those diagnoses came resources. So how is it that we can't get housing for these really sick women when the men are getting, all their safety nets filled, right? So that was a really big part of it. And that led us to really saying, you know what? Community research matters. And so we made the intention to build the capacity to also be able to do our own research, to be what I said, the go-to community partner on all things sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice in terms of research. And here we are with our own full, robust research program with studies that we own, that we run. The data belongs to us. And that's powerful. That's power. And I think that that's important for us to understand, that that power still came from our lived experiences of resisting being treated less than equal or less important than other players or even partners and collaborators that we had. The same people who I knew had appropriated, that's the word I'm going to use, had appropriated a lot of the elements of our work, we ended up working as partners on other studies over time and have done tremendous things together. So that doesn't mean we also have enemies. There's not a us and them. It's really about where's the justice, not the usness, but the justice in how we do this work. And that I think is also an exciting part of our story.
Yeah, I think that, the fact that I mean, was this the work that you also did with Terry McGovern and others when you were getting women's health onto the list for HIV, right? That was like a lot of legal.
Terry and I were partners and co-conspirators in that from the beginning, and we still are.
Right. And that's such phenomenal work, because the fact is that if, advocates and warriors like you didn't take this on, it would have been a long time before women could actually have been on even the treatment agenda, right? Because it was really focused at that time towards gay men.
And I do want to say, Nandini, that I think it's really important to make sure that we bookmark that and say that it was really with the leadership of particularly two, they're not the only two, but specifically two, Iris de la Cruz and Katrina Haskell, were two women of color, a Latina and a Black woman living with HIV, who insisted that we had to drive that campaign for them and the sisters that were like them. So I want to be very clear that Terry and I were a part of a movement that supported and followed the leadership of these women whose stories were the reason the fight was necessary.
Right. And it's important to acknowledge that it's those women who really led that. But you and Terry and others were instrumental in actually using that force to move things forward. One last issue in the work that you do, I think it was really interesting for us to hear when we had the conversation earlier around this shift from risk-based assessment for HIV, STI testing to what you call the healthy love assessment as a positive way of talking about illness and how you can actually access treatment versus sort of a negative risk. So I'm wondering if you could tell a little story about how you actually developed that and why that's been powerful in your work.
It's a simple thing of solving a problem that the problem that it came to solve, even though, like I said, we were intentional from the get-go of affirming women's sexuality. That's a core element of what it takes for us to make sure that women own their own ability to protect themselves, to negotiate for their own protection, for their own safety. And there are not any tools out there for us to do that with. We used to talk about the condom. I used to say the condom is an absolute choice for the men or for people with penises. And it was a negotiating item for women, right? Or even the internal condom is the same situation. So that's how we became a part of the microbicides fight as well. But later on, because we want tools that women can use without having to ask anybody else's permission or negotiate, that they should actually have all the agency.
Right.
And so along comes a revolutionary opportunity with an oral daily pill that you can take to prevent HIV. We now know it as PrEP, right? Here we are 12 years into PrEP, 12 years into PrEP almost, and we still have a minuscule number of cisgender, in particular women, who have indications for benefiting from taking PrEP, because if we had about 500,000 women who are most likely to be exposed to HIV to have access to PrEP in the United States, we could turn the trajectory on HIV incidence, just almost like that, right? And without having any real answers to why women haven't taken it up, other than the fact that they were not paying attention to, women hadn't been given the message that this is for women also. American women have never been included in any of the biomedical HIV prevention trials because of the way trial designs work. And so you had this guff, really, of an opportunity that people were scurrying, trying to figure out how. And my answer was, it's because you cannot talk about risk and sex with women the way you can with men who have sex with men, because they have been exposed and told from the beginning of this epidemic why they are at risk and what they need to do to eliminate that or to reduce that, women haven't been given that same opportunity because we don't get into our relationships in the same way. We don't think about our sex in the same way. And so that's why we said we got to flip this paradigm. We have to recognize that the other thing is, if I want a contraception, for example, and I go in to see someone about it and say, you know what, I don't want to get pregnant. Nobody asks me how many partners I'm having sex with, how many babies my partners have had with other people, whether or not, you know, they use protect. Nobody goes through all of that. They just say, okay, what's going on in your life? And here are the different options that you could use, which one you think is going to work best for you to have the best outcome for yourself. That's the kind of conversation we should be having around anything regarding our sexual health. What is it that you want? What is your goal? What are your aspirations? And let us score that and determine what your risk is without having to have you tell us what you think your risk is, because that's not how you think about it. And then offer up whatever tools we have. And the sad part is we still don't have enough. So we have to offer up other kinds of interventions that will give you the opportunity to take the agency and protect yourself. So like the Healthy Love Party, or like any of the other interventions that are out there, or maybe you're not ready for pre-exposure prophylaxis, but understand that if you have a moment where you think you've been exposed, there's post-exposure prophylaxis. Nobody's talking about those kinds of things, because what we're talking about is what's wrong with your sex life. Because if you don't get it right, you could die. That is not the message you want to tell me, so that I think that I am powered and not victimized enough, that I'm not a vessel or a victim, but that I'm a human who has needs and desires about the best sex life that I want to have, and I need you to help me figure out how to get there.
And you mentioned something there about how pharmaceutical teams are interested in this, and that might be interesting for this group, like to hear about why that has caught their attention.
So I think that everybody finally, stop trying to do the same thing over and over and expect something different to happen. And so when they hear that from community, because we keep saying, if you listen to us, we might have some solutions, and you should put some resources to us to help figure out whether we are right or not. And this is one of those instances where I happen to continue talking about it. And the pharmaceutical that is putting out the next tool, if you will, in the pre-exposure prophylaxis space is an injectable. They call it long-acting. Again, if you had listened to the women, if you had listened to what our own experiences are with contraception, you would have never called this a long-acting injectable. But either way, with that, they're doing implementation studies, and they too have been thinking about better ways. And, they've got competition, right? So the other pharma didn't get it right with the oral daily. So maybe with the injectable, we're going to approach populations and communities who are at more risk around this injectable, but we don't want to use that approach because it hasn't worked for the daily pill. So what's out there, they found us, they heard my story, that we sent them our tool, they loved it. We're now working directly together to adapt it for those studies. But in exchange, because I don't necessarily have to only have money, what I do want is your partnership for us to continue to test our tool. Yeah. And not only that, but to now go back to our Healthy Love Party, right? And evaluate its adaptation for using this new sexual health assessment and moving risk out of the Healthy Love Party, but also integrating the biomedical prevention information, education, and tools as well. And that's what we're negotiating right now, so that it's a quid pro quo above board.
That's just fantastic. There's so much to ask you, and your story is so rich and has so many things, but I wanted to pivot to the global health work, because it's unusual to have someone who's so embedded in community here in the US and yet have this very strong partnership in South Africa. So I think it would be wonderful to just share that story of how you developed your work in South Africa and what triggered it, I think many years ago when you were telling us about meeting someone in particular who really triggered, this work for you in South Africa.
I'll start out with saying that, when I told you about how we were started working with the other AIDS organization and then bringing it into my organization where I was working at the time, it was a really lonely place to start out Sister Love with the intersectional experience that I came with, not even having the language yet, right? Sister Love started the same year that Kimberly Crenshaw coined
Right.
intersectionality, even though we know that Bell Hooks had already been writing and speaking on the multiple oppressions before. Either way, though, there's this there was this lonely place of trying to do HIV in the context of sexual and reproductive health, right? There wasn't another organization, there weren't a lot of places that we could go that this was happening that we could learn from. And so we were very intentional about being in the international space. The other experience is that this was a Black women's issue, right? That was clear from the beginning. And so what are other Black women in other countries doing about this? And to get out there in the world and find that out. So we wanted to see how was HIV or AIDS at the time being addressed at the International Women in Health meeting, the seminal point was at the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo in 1994, when I met the incredible and amazing Prudence Mabelli. She was still very young at that time. I think at that point she might have been like 23. Yeah. Who at the age of 21, when she was still a college student, a university student, learned of her AIDS diagnosis and was like one of the first Black women in South Africa here to go public with her status. Imagine how that went down in 1991, 92, 93. Before there was any real knowledge of what the SLIMS disease meant for women at that time. And she had the same frustrations as we did when we were at the ICPD meeting in Cairo, that how are we talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights and there's no AIDS in the agenda? That program, that plan of action came out of that conference. The UN, the 100 and however many countries adopted that plan, and it never addressed HIV, right? And then we get to Beijing a year later, where Prudence's work and our work together probably did more than half of any and all the sessions that were on AIDS in Beijing. So we just promised to work together, and didn't have, cell phones, didn't have WhatsApp, didn't have, we had fax machines and pagers.
Right.
And that was when a 5-minute phone call could cost you $200, right? So that wasn't happening. But we have finally got a grant to do a twinning initiative through the CDC and USAID. And that's what kicked off a relationship. What I think is most important about that is I already had a connection with South Africa because of my anti-apartheid movement work on my campus. But most importantly, the parallel, the common experiences, regardless of economy of scale, the common experiences of women in the South, in the deep South in the United States, and women in the global South in the southern region of Africa, we had more stories in common than we even knew, because we were living through apartheid and Jim Crow / civil rights, and we were living in areas that were left behind in terms of economic and education opportunities for women, the gender-based violence or violence against women situations, the inequality, all of that we could talk about in commonality. So that's what we started. And it's just been a passion that, because we're in this unique space, there's so much that we have learned, that we have brought home, that looks very novel in the United States. But it is actually this really practical application in a situation of no resources, right? and then what we've been able to transfer is how to build the movement from not to build the movement, but how do I want to say it? To actually use our own stories to create the programs and the projects that we need, so that we don't have this sense of the dependency on the North or the West, or in the United States, the North or the West, to come into the South and solve our problems, right? And so that's where we got started. And it has been an incredible journey ever since. And we are still on that road, and we're even more closely working than we ever have before because we are being intentional about finding those real core common elements for Black women across the world, and then building solidarity just to work on those problems. Not everybody's problems. You can work on those individually in your countries and regions. But
Right.
if we're finding three common issues that if you solved or hit a dent on these three issues for Black women everywhere in the world, we would change a whole lot. And if we don't do that, we're not going to get to the end of this epidemic of HIV or
Right.
the epidemic of gender-based violence or anything else. So that's what's been important for us, is building global solidarity to solve the problem.
And that is such a compelling part of your story, because I think it sort of defies all of the models of aid and development. And I think really the way forward, where we partner so that there's no hierarchy in how we share, our information, our knowledge, our practices, because honestly, as you said, we don't have to have it as a one way from the north to the south or west to the east. And so I think this is such a powerful model that I hope others follow, because it's a wonderful collaboration that allows learning across many, many borders. I think my last story that I'm going to get from you, or just to have you share with us before we move to questions, is the whole issue of COVID-19 and how that has converged with HIV work at SisterLove and beyond. And also because, as I started the storytelling session by saying, COVID-19 yet again reminds us of these terrible inequalities, whatever way you cut it, whether it's gender, whether it's race or income, we're just seeing that all over again. So how is that something that SisterLove is tackling in the current work that you're doing, or connecting with those who are actually working on COVID?
Well, so intersectionality is a thing, right? And we work to make it practical. When this situation, I was actually here in South Africa when it first broke. As a matter of fact, I think we shut down a week after I got back to the United States. And what we were most concerned about from the beginning, other than the virility of the virus itself, was the response to the virus and what it meant for women and girls. And that was eye-opening for us, but it was also immediate. So we understood that this response to COVID-19 had to come from some of the same places that we were already doing our work, right? What are we doing to make sure, for example, that when they shut everything down, that sexual and reproductive health services, just like HIV services, are considered as essential health care? What are we doing to make sure that there are paths to safety? Because you're sending children home from school, you're putting moms back in homes where leaving home is safer than being at home because of the domestic violence and gender-based violence. So how are we addressing those issues? And so we had to start thinking about how are we morphing what we do in person to digital from the very, very beginning. It took a lot of organizations a long time to figure out how to shift and pivot. Not us. We already, because we're that group, right? We already had, for example, a stockpile of self-test kits because we had been doing something innovative with the Essence Festival the year before, right? So we immediately started working on getting HIV test kits, pregnancy test kits into people's homes, nice packaging that didn't give away anything, had them directly connect with us. We had already started our telehealth program like a month before the lockdown happened, those kinds of things. And we were very intentional about saying, whoever we are, whatever we're doing going into this pandemic, we want to be better and better able to serve. We're going to learn more about how to get to people when they cannot get out and get to us, right? And make it feel like they're with us, even if it's virtual. So we've been able to do that, both here in South Africa as well in the United States. We did a lot more work and have done a lot more on the gender-based violence issue. We also, I think what's important is had to make sure that we were involved in understanding how this whole COVID thing, the vaccine thing was laying out, because we had already been a part of the research literacy world around the HIV vaccine, right? And just like at the real high levels, you know, if you took a look at all of the folks who were pulled in to respond to COVID at the, you know, science level and at the policy level, they all came from people who were in the HIV field. They took a lot of our HIV professionals, our scientists, our public health practitioners, our epidemiologists, our strategists, and, you know, including, I actually was at the PEPFAR COP meeting here in South Africa with Ambassador Birx when the vice president's office sent his detail team down here to get her, right? So we already were seeing how HIV was so important to the COVID response. But what about the community HIV community? I mean, HIV expertise. And so we've worked with other partners to be a part of the global COVID community advisory groups. We have worked to make sure that we were a part of the testing. We're now a part of the vaccination, that we can get to people so much faster and so much more effectively and efficiently than these, you know, behemoth public health structures. So that's what we did. We partnered up with churches even to say, you can do the testing, you've got the drive-through stuff happening, let us hand out our HIV tests so that we can be doing COVID-19 and HIV prevention at the same time. And we actually just got another $100,000 grant to continue doing that work with vaccines, the COVID vaccines and testing, along with the same church partners that we've been working with for the last 2 years. So it really is using our practical story, our stories, our practical experiences, and our community relationships to go into the issues that were not going to necessarily be addressed at the get-go, including stuff around vaccine hesitancy. It gave us a chance to even go deeper into the history, for example, the horrific and the best parts of the history of how Black women have been objectified, subjugated, abused in research, to the point where without Black women in the research, you are going to fail. And so that's where we have come for now with COVID-19, and coming out of COVID-19 in the same way, and making sure that there's equity. So like the fight to end the vaccine apartheid is as much a fight for us in our human rights work that we do as it is to make sure that the HIV cure and the HIV vaccine research does not leave out women, especially Black women. So it's for us, it's almost all a part of the same. There are people who have been doing the same fight around Hep C until we made sure that women were included in those trials and in those treatment studies so that they could get to the cure the same time that the men do. It's all the same fight.
Right. And you know, I think we should thank you and others who have actually been working on the ground at the community level to ensure that people understand the whole vaccine issue and do go and get their vaccinations as they should. But I'm going to turn now to some of the questions. I almost feel like, because it's such a small group, we could open it up, but I don't know technologically whether we can do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and read out some of the questions that our friends have shared. So someone asked, can you say more about Brave Spaces? What are they? How do you use them? And how can we build them?
Absolutely. So thank you for that question as well. So one of my best friends in the whole wide world, actually not one of, she actually is at the top of the list. So my best friend in the whole wide world is Loretta J. Ross, who is in this point in her life really honing in on this notion of calling in, right? So we can talk about that. But the brave spaces have to be spaces where we're not setting up people to say this is a safe space, because your own story and how deeply you can go into touching things that may have traumatic impacts, that there may be triggers in conversations when we're talking about tough situations, let's say gender-based violence in the era of COVID-19, right? that there have to be ways that we hold our conversations that acknowledge people's traumas and triggers, that acknowledge people's differences, that acknowledge that people aren't always on the same page, acknowledge that not everybody can hold back their judgment, and create spaces where you have built the trust to be fully present with your own story in that space, and know that even if there's some trepidation about where your story can go, like how much power you give up when you share that story, that's what it's meant by a brave space, right? Is that you have to be able to know that the people in this room or in this conversation or in this moment are going to hold you and hold your story in its totality without destroying you, right? Because that's the fear of talking up in a support group or in any kind of space, even in a meeting space where, you know, we're dealing with all of the stuff like the imposter syndrome kind of thing. That overcoming and surpassing those kinds of barriers that are more or less internal means that you have to find and tap the courage. And a part of that courage is a part of, it actually comes from your own recognizing my own resilience, right? That the truth of the matter is that you're still here because whatever you've been through, you made it through. However you made it through, you made it through, and that's your story, so that when you're in these situations, you know you can make it through because you've already done it. And that's what I think creating brave space means, is that you got this, girl, and we got you. That's what it means.
Okay, that's great. That's really, I think that's something that I'm going to certainly use moving forward instead of safe space. Another question is not so much a question, but more asking for your thoughts about access to care. The FDA just this evening permanently approved the abortion pill being allowed to be sent via email. It broadens access to care. Would love your thoughts. This is from Maria.
Yes. Thank you, Maria, because I tell you, part of my week, this week, I think when I did hit a pretty low, point in my biorhythm, a low point in my inflection, was that we got the word that the international, well, it happened last Thursday, the International Partnership for Microbicides pulled their application for the dapivirine ring, which has already achieved approval by UNAIDS and WHO, right? And there's a new fight in terms of the FDA not wanting one of the oral contraceptives over the counter to keep moving forward towards its application process. So to get this news today was just, over the moon. Now it gives us more, puts more, I guess, I don't want to use the militaristic or war mentality, but it actually gives us more energy. It gives us more fuel in our fight for access to medication abortion across this country. Because in states like Georgia, medication abortion by law is in person. It still requires that whole 24-hour notification crap. It's treated just like in-person abortion. And we're in a space where we're moving towards a future where there should be more health care in our own hands, not less. That there should be more easy access to safe products and safe devices than less access. And we know that the opposition is fighting for us to have no access. And so this is really, really important for us in this day and age, that we're able to use this new decision by the FDA to push better policy, because everything is going state by state. And to do it at a time when we're sitting up here really, really, really nervous, really angry, really in an anxious position around what the Supreme Court is about to do with the Dobbs case out of Mississippi, and with the SB8 case out of Texas, and other cases that are now starting to just pile up because, they do what my mother used to call that monkey see, monkey do thing, where where she called it, like just because somebody has something that you have to have it. That's how these legislatures are working right now on all of their suppression of voting, suppression of access to reproductive health. All of it is happening state by state, and I live in one of those states that would be moving on that pretty quickly since we already have a 6-week ban that's on the books. So it's really, really important. It's really powerful. It's a little light of hope for us to protect women's access to bodily autonomy and to their right to choose what they want to do with their families.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question from Sia. She says, so appreciate the impact that you and other US women of color activists had at key UN moments and how much you shaped my view of what global advocacy means as a young Kenyan woman. Organizing for ICPD was when I first met you. Over 25 years after Beijing, are you and SisterLove involved in generation equality?
Yes, we are. I actually sit on the Global Advisory Council for UNFPA. So we were a part of a lot of that planning. We were at ICPD plus 25 in Nairobi, where a lot of the continued plans for generation was happening. We have not yet become as directly involved because there's not so much of it happening on the ground in the US. But in South Africa, we absolutely are engaged in that and doing it in different ways. Our approach, honestly, right now is, and I don't know if I talked about this with you or if it comes up somewhere, Nandini, but for example, before we can even get to all of the issues that are on the agenda for generation equality, in South Africa, if we don't get a handle on the gender-based violence and femicide, nothing else is going to matter. Equal pay won't matter, equal treatment, equal access in the policy world, leadership, none of that will matter if they just are continuing to kill us with impunity. And so I am one who believes that we definitely have to engage men and we definitely have to shift ideology and culture. But I'm also an Aries, and I've been doing this work for 37 years, and I'm damn impatient now, and I am not interested in waiting until people change policy and change minds. I need to get people out of the line of fire, right? And so one of the ways that we're looking at it right now without apology is looking at what Rebecca and the other sisters have done with the Umoja and Unity villages in the Samburu tribe regions of Eastern Kenya. We are actually looking at helping appropriate land so that women can build their own women-only villages and communities where they learn to govern, communally work together, build their own houses even, build their own businesses, raise their children in safety, provide a safe haven, over a longer period of time, not a 90-day transition, but a place where you truly can reset and break the cycle and have a different determination for yourself so that when you do have to go back out into this world, you can show up in a different way that is sort of like that Gwen Stefani? I can't remember. Whoever's got that holla back song, where you are not that holla back girl that you were before you came into a village where everything was about how women have the power to self-determine and to govern and to grow and develop and to be successful with it. That's what I am working towards. And that doesn't sit necessarily within generation equality, but it definitely sits within an agenda that generation equality is aiming for. So that's what our contribution is going to be.
Wonderful. I'm going to share a question from Laura Hemeke, where she says, how do you remain so strong in such challenging conditions? How can we ourselves remain resilient in the continued fight for agency justice? How do you not lose hope?
Because I refuse. So I resist it. It's easy to fall into that. What I think first and foremost is I deeply believe in the power of our ancestry, right? I believe not only in the true factual, stuff that you can touch about what people before us have done, but the fact that they have done it and that it exists in our universe and that they have their own stories. And the fact is they didn't give up either. And if they went to their graves fighting, then I don't have any excuses either. And so even on those days that are the dimmest, right, the thing I have to grab onto is that somebody has already done some of this hard work for you. Mm-hmm. And whatever is hard in front of you now, if you don't go after it, you're only making it harder for those who are coming behind. So that's what keeps me going. That and what I call my sisters who go from resilience to resistance to revolution. If you can survive some of the horrors and then come into the work and do the work on behalf of your own survival and thriving, but everybody else, like the women who are diagnosed with HIV and show up every day living out loud with HIV and doing work in the HIV field, when they could go back, one of my sister friends, she was an assistant attorney general in a state office when she was diagnosed with HIV. And she went down that tube, right? And once she hit that bottom, realized that nobody was going to pick her up but herself. And there are so many women, whether they've survived violence, whether they have survived cancer, whether they have survived conflict, whether they have survived, the horrors of some migrants, people on the move as migrants or asylees or refugees. The fact that they come in to the work and are doing it every day. I don't have those lived experiences. And if I'm complaining about how hard the work is, I need to go sit down.
Right. And I really liked the resilience to resistance to revolution. That's a really good construct to think about in how we think about our work in the face of such adversity and challenges. So thank you so much for that. I wanted to, I think we're beginning to wind down, but I wanted to, I don't think we have any more questions. So I wanted to ask you, Dazon, what do you think was the most difficult point in your career or so far, and how have you resolved that? Is there something that stands out for you, because you have worked on this pathway of resilience, resistance, and revolution? So what is it that you see that sticks out at you as something that was extremely challenging, and how you actually address that?
Oh, that's not hard. So I always had said getting into this work that, one, I'm in it to win it. Mm-hmm. But prior to that, it was, I'm here to do what I'm supposed to do, and then I can move on to whatever I'm supposed to do next, which basically meant I actually said, I'm going to be at SisterLove 10 years, and if it hadn't done what it's supposed to do, that's, neither here nor there. But before I got to those 10 years, I took a hiatus and went to grad school. We made a terrible hire. I had not done any of including my board, had not prepared appropriately for that kind of leadership transition, even though the organization was about 6 or 7 years old at that time. And when I came back, as a matter of fact, the week after I got my master's, got the call, the IRS was coming to shut the door. They literally come and lock you up. We had lost contracts, projects and programs because we had just made a really bad hire and done a very terrible job at leaving the organization safe in the transition of me out. So it was just the worst executive type transition ever. And one of the most dedicated, most committed, beloved staff member. She was an elder woman. She was a probably 15-year person who was in recovery as a former substance user and was a mentor and an NA sponsor for so many other women. And she and the new executive director just didn't get along. The new executive director, like I said, she was horrible. And she terminated her. And I know how much SisterLove meant to that woman. I said, you know, I can't step into the new leader's work. I can't, you know, undermine her or overshadow her. And so I just stayed in my world and let SisterLove do what it's going to do. And that sister relapsed, and within 6 months of leaving SisterLove had died of an overdose. So the thing that sticks with me, which is why and I'm on the trajectory for an executive transition. We have to have new energy. I'm building stuff that I don't plan to run. We got a lot of really big initiatives coming that I am too old and tired to actually be in charge of, but I want to see them happen. And I want to see them happen in a way that, unlike when Prudence passed away a couple of years ago, Positive Women's Network is floundering. When my friend Pandora Singleton passed away in 2004, her organization was folded a year later. I've seen this over and over, and that from that lesson then to the lesson forward when I do make my executive transition, it will be because we have built the strongest infrastructure and foundation. And because I left money, so it didn't have to do with the money. It had to do with the organization's capacity to continue in the absence of the founding vision, right? Or visionary. And so that's what concerns me the most, is making sure that we not only get it right, but that we get it right for SisterLove. So we don't have to follow somebody's cookie cutter version of how you make an executive transition. We want to learn what we need and make sure that we build what needs to be built. And that is the one thing that drives me in every single thing we do and every decision we make, is, are we building this to sustain once I am no longer the lead?
That is actually incredible, because I think that shows the strength of a leader like you, who is preparing for a transition that will keep the organization going even after the visionary has left. And I think that often is the downfall of many organizations, as you said. So on that note, I just wanted to say that there's so much we could talk about. There's so much in your story that I would love to keep chatting about, but I promised that I would end the storytelling at 8:45. And I wanted to pass this back to Women in Global Health. And I would like to make a petition that we have one song, one more song from Dazon before we actually head off for the night. Thank you so much, Dazon.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. This was fun. Looking forward to it. And guess what? I'm still wide awake.
I know.
Oh, well, we so appreciate you. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel. I am the current co-chair of Women in Global Health, the Georgia chapter. And it's just been such a pleasure to share this time with you all. And huge, huge thanks to Nandini and Dazon for this marvelous discussion. And I am feeling just, so inspired in times when sometimes inspiration can be hard to come by. So thank you for this incredibly enriching conversation. I also want to give a shout out and thanks to our programs chair, Lauren Abrams, who helped organize. And as always, our partner organization supporters at the Center for Global Health Innovation, Maria Thacker-Gothi and Christina Forbes. And then finally, I would be remiss in concluding tonight's session if I did not say a special word of thanks and recognition to my outgoing co-chair who helped found the Women in Global Health Georgia chapter, Mahal Wadid Sadek, who actually organized this event. tonight. So it has been such a huge honor and privilege to get to know Mahal and to work with her. She has founded and led the organization with her vast intellect as well as her grace and good humor. And we are forever grateful to you, Mahal, for your service as you rotate out and the wonderful Alyssa rotates on. So with that note of thanks, I will wish everyone a festive, restful, and safe holiday season. And Dazon, if you will favor us with a song to see us out, we would love that.
And before that, would it be possible if we got like a group shot with everyone with their cameras on, if they're willing to? That would be nice.
That sounds
great. That would be really nice. Fantastic. So should I take it? Or do you want to take it, Catherine? Do you have your camera, your phone?
Someone that's on a computer, I'm on a phone. It probably won't take as well.
You got it? You got it, Rachel? Okay, super.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, super. Thank you. So yeah, let's end with a song.
So
I mean, we have to use our DJ Supreme over here.
I'm happy to do so. I'm going to do this one. I was going to do First Nanas, but I want to do this one because I think that one of our latest, best voices right now, even though it's not a cisgender woman, it's not a woman's voice, is so inspiring, and that's Billy Porter, because I've been saying that if Black folks are half the epidemic, there have to be more than Magic Johnson in our celebrity space who can give us voices, right? There has to be, but we recognize and we understand why they cannot disclose or be out about it. We know what that's all about in the cancel culture that we have these days. So I am honoring Billy Porter as our closeout song tonight, if that's all right.
Always remember who